I'm Kat Morgan, and this is On the Arc, where we embark on a journey to discover the power of lived experience and the transformative stories that shape our paths. In a world where connection and understanding matter more than ever, we'll explore the diverse narratives of recovery and chances for change. Let's set sail, because the voyage into the heart of lived experience begins right here, right now. It's a podcast about coming together to share collective wisdom from the lived experience community. We'll share stories of lived experience of mental distress, of recovery, and we will explore alternatives to the medical model, talking to people who've been there and people who are creating change. It's hosted by me, Kat. I have my own lived experience of mental distress. Each episode will follow two guests, one who will share what they have learnt through their own experiences, and the other who will talk about practical ways that change is coming, and how as a community we can move away from the medical model and utilise the power of people who have been there. This podcast is made possible by the 100% lived experience organisation Aspire Recovery Connection, also known as ARC. A big shout out to them for helping make this podcast happen. First, we'll hear from Emrys. So, Emrys, can you tell us a bit about yourself, like outside of like mental health advocacy, aside from like your work and stuff? Like, what do you like? What do you do? I don't know, just hobbies or like anything like that?
Yeah, so typical kind of like geeky stuff. I watch a lot of anime, play a lot of video games. I have a car that's imported from Japan and a motorcycle, so I'm into like cars and that sort of stuff. Yeah, and I guess like I do a bit of like art and creative things as well. But yeah, that's pretty much where most of my interests lie.
Nice. And yeah, have you been like watching anything good recently, reading anything good, like podcasts or TV shows?
I'm actually reading a series. I've got to try and remember the name now. So like the first book in the series is like A Court of Thorns and Roses, and it's like a whole massive series, and there's like multiple series that are kind of like linked in by the same author, and it's like a fantasy, fairy, monsters, evil things sort of like
nice. Yeah,
book
I've been reading
situation.
This cool kind of fantasy one recently it's called Different Not Damaged or something.
Nice.
And it's like fantasy, but it kind of has references to like disability and stuff all the way through. It's so cool. And it's not like explicitly this is a disability, it's just like weaved in.
Yeah, it's not like this is a disabled character. It's like this is the character and they happen to be disabled.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, so it's really cool. Yeah, I haven't read much fantasy, but I'm getting into it a bit recently. And then, moving through to why you're our guest today on the podcast, what do you do in the mental health space? What do you do in the peer work space?
Yeah, so I guess, like, I kind of have two sort of streams in which I kind of, like, function in. Like, one of them is, like, when I'm working for Centre Care, I'm a peer educator in the Certificate 4 in Mental Health Peer Work. So yeah, currently we're the only like provider in South Australia, so that's a lot, but it's good that there's a significant demand in South Australia and in regional locations as well, because we're doing regional delivery. And then when I'm not doing that and I'm not resting, I sort of do, I guess, like leadership stuff and like co-design things, peer supervision. I just do like a lot of like ad hoc stuff when I'm not doing like my Centre Care like peer educator work, because it's just kind of like what I have the extra energy for outside of that. Yeah,
so how long has the peer work course like been around with Centre Care doing it? And what is it? Can you explain a bit more about it?
So I guess like the peer work course itself dates back to like, I think the first pilot of it was in 2012, and then it became like a mainstream course offered in 2015. I'm not sure how long it's been on scope exactly for Centre Care. I I think it's probably been maybe around 3 years, but I've only been with Centre Care for a year and a half now. So it's definitely longer than that. But basically, like, the course pretty much is for anyone that, like, identifies as having lived or living experience of, you know, like, mental health distress, but we're trying to also kind of, like, broaden that scope as well, because, like, there's more than just distress that's specifically related to mental health. Like, we have a lot of people that have, you know, like, experience with, like, alcohol and other drugs coming through and doing the peer work course. And yeah, like, there's a lot of different areas that lived experience can be really, like, beneficial and used in. And it just teaches people how to use their lived experience in a safe way, using a framework so that they can apply that in an actual skill set and take it on as a career.
And then maybe, like, to quickly take a step back, for people who have never heard of peer work, or, like, maybe have lived experience but they're not super familiar with all of the kind of, I don't know what the word would be, lingo. How would you describe peer work to someone who, like, doesn't know anything about it?
I would probably say that, like, a peer worker is someone that has gone on their own, like, really extensive recovery journey from specific things or from ongoing things, and they provide support to another person, and it can look really different depending on what kind of role it, you know, what kind of role it's in, but usually it's more like providing, like, support between two people that's, like, less about those power imbalances and, like, you know, having someone that's, like, alongside you and can potentially relate a lot more to what you have been through or what you're going through, and it's more of a connection and, like, relational focus and approach to support.
Cool. Yeah, I like it. Actually, so, my next question was going to be, what led you to get involved in this stuff? How did you find peer work or become, you know, the educator at Centre Care, things like that? How did you...
It all relatively happened, like, by accident, really. I was studying way back in, like, 2015 to become a psychologist, and then had quite a significant episode in my own, like, mental health, which just took me way off of that path. And then I eventually studied just, like, a regular certificate in mental health. Because I didn't even know that the peer work certificate was a thing back when I did my study. And I just, after I got that, was just looking at different mental health roles, and I just stumbled across a peer work role, and I was like, whoa, this is really cool. This is kind of like what I've been doing my whole life informally, and now I have a qualification and maybe I can do this. And so I went into that and realized, like, this is definitely a special interest of mine. And I guess, like, I just built up a lot of skills and eventually, like, got my peer work qualifications, like, officially after doing peer work for a few years. And then I got a little bit burnt out, and I was like, what else could I maybe do? And some of my connections from different, like, leadership spaces in South Australia were like, well, this is a thing that you could do maybe. And I just kind of was like, I will give that a go. So I feel like it's such a, like, peer work answer of how I got into things. I'm like, I don't know, just by, like, chance and by connection and by, like, just following, kind of just, like, following whatever ebb and flow is happening.
And then, can you maybe tell us a bit more about, like, sort of, I guess, the philosophies that underpin peer work, or I guess how it might be a bit different from, like, just, like, a standard mental health certificate or a standard, whatever the word is, like, approach, more mainstream approach to things.
So I guess, like, peer work definitely has its own set of, like, philosophies and values, but then there's also the particular types of, like, specializations and values that each individual brings into their peer work role. But I guess if we're thinking about philosophies, so some of the philosophies that really align with peer work is kind of like more trauma-informed care, person-centered care. So like really focusing on that individual as someone that is unique, an expert in their own experience, you know, a person that deserves agency and respect in their life. And I guess it's also about like not seeing people as flawed, not seeing people as sick or, you know, like a problem to be fixed. You know, so yeah, I guess like there's a lot of different values as well that come under around like connection and mutuality, which is about not having those really intense power imbalances, but also personal recovery instead of, you know, clinical recovery. So instead of like trying to reduce someone's symptoms, we just go like, what does the life that you want to live look like? And
with or without.
Let's get there together.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, why do you think it's important that this peer work course exists, or just peer work in general, but maybe the peer work course specifically as well?
Yeah, I think it's important, and I guess like there's a few like different discussions sort of happening in South Australia at the moment of, you know, like professionalisation of the peer workforce. Like, I think it's important that we have like multiple options for peer workers to get into like a professionalised role. But I think the certificate for mental health peer work is definitely important to have, because it offers people a framework, and it helps connect people in with a community. It helps them have a learning space where they can practice like using their lived experience and practice the type of skills and experiment with the type of peer worker that they want to be before they get out into the sector where they're going to be working with people that are potentially in a lot more vulnerable positions than some of their classmates, where, you know, you're in a contained environment where you can just sort of figure out how you want to do things and how you want to show up as a peer worker. I think one of the most important things that I've noticed is just that like people really like value themselves as peer workers a lot more when they go through a course like this, because I've also seen a lot of like established peer workers come through to I guess like formalize their qualifications, or you know, just touch up their knowledge. And I find that that's such a huge gap in that, you know, there's brilliant peer workers that don't value themselves in the way that they can and should, just because of how the sector operates.
Like it almost maybe makes them feel like they can really, I mean, not that they're not already credible, but like feel more credible or feel more qualified almost, even though they already are, or like
feel like they're like on the right track, like
maybe as being like the important part of things that they are.
Yeah, that's another thing as well, that you know, like unfortunately the mental health sector at large, you know, does focus on people's qualifications and what ticks and certificates they do or don't have, and you know, it's unfortunate that that is such a strong focus, but sometimes we do need to sort of be like, well, actually I do have training, so don't discredit you know, lived experience input or peer input, because it's a professional workforce. It's its own discipline. Full stop. Yeah.
And before I move on to our last question, is there anything like that you really wanted to mention, anything that you wanted to touch on that we haven't touched on yet in our conversation that you think is really important to know about the peer work course or peer work in general?
That's a good question. I guess like I think one thing that is like, I guess, really important to, I guess, like share in the context of peer work is there's like no one way to do peer work. And I would just really encourage people to like, you know, if a certificate for mental health peer work doesn't feel like accessible to them, that doesn't mean that they can't become a peer worker. very passionate about hopefully having like a few different pathways into the peer workforce in general, so that it's more accessible for a wide range of folks. You know, there's quite a number of peer workers that are really well established that a certificate for just isn't an accessible option for them, but they're still an incredible peer worker. So I'd probably just encourage people that if using your lived experience sounds like something you really want to do, look into the Cert 4, and if it doesn't seem like a viable option, don't stop there. Like, look for other things like intentional peer support and like other avenues, and even just like volunteer peer spaces like the drop-in care space and stuff, where, you know, you can connect in with that community. I would just really encourage people that if they feel drawn to work in a peer space, that they do that in a way that works for them.
And then maybe like last one before my last question. Now it's the last one. Just like if people, we can put stuff in the show notes, like links or whatever, but is there anywhere in particular people can go to find out more about this stuff?
Yeah, so people can go to the like Centrecare website, and there's like a certificate for peer work section in there. They can also email like the main email address for the RTO and get kind of like a little bit of an info pack sent out to them, and they can get on like the interest list for the next cohort that's coming through.
Cool. And now to the actual last question. We're asking everyone who comes on the ARC podcast kind of a bit of a pun or something on the ARC thing, that if there was one thing, if, you know, everything was going to go and, you know, flooding or whatever, if there was one thing you would, like, out of the help that you've received across your own personal journey with your lived experience, so yeah, if there was one thing you could take with you from the help or the support you've received, and one thing you could just leave behind to sort of drown, what would you take and what would you leave?
I think the thing that I would take behind, and it's sort of leave behind, and it's sort of more of like a concept, or it's more of like an attitude that I've seen across a lot of professional people in clinical space, is just like that expert opinion that they seem to have, and on defining who someone is and who they are going to be and what their limits for the rest of their life are going to look like. I would probably leave that to drown, because it's probably some of the most like harmful stuff, I would say, like you know, in a very vulnerable time where I didn't feel powerful, and then someone who was definitely way more powerful than me was like, forget your potential and, you know, this is your reality forevermore. And what would I take with me? Like, my immediate thought is like just like myself, because when I think about what my recovery journey has been like, because I didn't know that peer work existed, and because I, you know, have had quite an extensive like journey from quite a young age through to adulthood, for me, I'm just like, really, I'm like the only person that like got me through this, like maybe I would probably bring in community, probably, and try and like have connected in with that a bit earlier, because I think
like lived experience community, or like just in general,
I think
your community
in general, just like different communities and connection, like and especially the lived experience space, but also like lived experience work is hard and it's draining. So I think as well, like, just like general community and connection, being able to connect with people in a way that, like, I don't always have to be focused on, like, lived experience
in
is
a way
really
that's,
like
bigger than those things.
Yeah.
All those experiences.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting with me this morning. It was lovely to have you.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you for having me. It was a very cool experience.
So, I'm here for the next interview. I'm with Danni.
About me, I am a mum to 2 teenagers who are pretty cool. I think I was always scared of having teenagers because of what I was like as a teenager, but they're much better than me, so that's really cool. I like to get out in nature. That's really important to me, and go hiking and camping whenever I can. I like food and cooking. And I have a little dog called Eddie, who's a Pugglier, and he's really cool. And outside of that, work has been a big part of my life. I guess I've been passionate about social justice and changing, I guess, society and inequity through bringing lived experience voice. And I'm very lucky to currently be a managing director at Aspire Recovery Connection, where we have a 100% lived experience team.
An icebreaker thing, we're asking everyone what sort of like media, like books, podcasts, movies they've been like watching or consuming lately.
Yeah. I don't watch a lot of movies. I don't really know why. I like going to the movies, but I sort of don't have the attention span for a full movie, but then I'll binge a series for like 2 movies worth. Books, I'm currently reading, I'm actually listening to it as an audio book. And this one, the author is the narrator as well, which I really like because it gives that a really personal connection with the book that they're reading. So I'm reading Lost Connections by Johann Hari, and it's about he's an investigative journalist, and it's about his journey of anxiety and depression and his, I guess, experience through the medical model and the medical treatment of that for many years, and ultimate search for something beyond that. And as an investigative journalist, he investigates the medical model related to anxiety and depression and Western culture and the high rates of anxiety and depression and what's causing that, and what hope there is for ways to heal ourselves outside of purely medical approach. That's really cool.
No, that's super interesting.
And TV series, I've been watching Afterlife with Ricky Gervais. He's I like his comedy, but I think it's amazing how he brings that together with something, really sad, and doesn't try and I guess paint it in a lighter way. It just lets that kind of sadness sit there, but brings in humour. It's cool.
And then sort of why did you want to be a guest on the podcast, and how are you feeling about it? Given it's
on the ARC podcast and I'm part of ARC, there was an opportunity to, I'm really excited to be part of it. I'm a bit nervous, even though I was saying to you, I'm like helping you do the bookings and asking other people to be on our podcast, and now it's my turn. I'm like shitting myself a bit, but
hopefully I can make it as comfy as possible. We can have a good chat. So what do you think you've learned along your own lived experience journey that like sort of continues to, I guess, serve you even like today in the present?
Lots of things. I think one of the most powerful things I've learned is that my unwellness, and that fluctuates from currently, you know, I'm in a pretty good space to, you know, prior to that, decades of not being. The thing I've learned is that it's not my fault. I think that's the most powerful thing that I learned, and it took me a really long time to find someone that could help me, or that could even tell me that and then help me kind of accept that, which took a long time to accept it. But that, my experience of mental and emotional distress, which kind of presents as depression and anxiety, isn't my fault. Yeah, I think that's, that's the most powerful thing I've learned.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a big one. Big thing to learn.
Yeah, and I think it was offered to me very early on that it wasn't my fault because I was sick, and that's not my fault. That didn't help. I think it's not my fault, not because, in inverted commas, I've got an illness, but because stuff, you know, happened throughout my life, and that I just blocked and pushed down until it couldn't be pushed down anymore, and then I became really unwell. But that stuff's not my fault. Yeah.
And I guess it kind of links back to the last question, but what sort of strengths have you found or have you built through that experience and through that, through that experience?
Yeah. I think a really common response I was thinking about this is resilience, and I hate that term. Like, I really hate it. It bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think we have to be resilient. Yeah.
It's almost a lot of pressure.
Heaps of pressure. And it's like, you're not good enough. You have to be more resilient. I completely reject it. But so I think the strength that I've been able to build, and again, it took a really, really long time. Like, I'm going like 20 years, really, is self-compassion. And being kind to myself at all times, but particularly if I'm feeling unwell or if things in my life aren't going that well, is that deep kindness and self-compassion.
Yeah, and I'm guessing like maybe that self-compassion has really helped with this side of it, but what's sort of the hardest or like the most challenging thing that you've found about living with like mental and emotional distress and all of those sorts of things?
For me, like at a personal level, it's been just the relentlessness of it. When it just doesn't stop, and you just want to
break for a bit.
Yeah, it's like I just want to push a button or flick a switch and just go. I just want a little break, and it just didn't stop for, I don't know, days, weeks, years. Just didn't stop. I think that was the hardest thing, and that's why I don't believe the term resilience is true or helpful for anyone, because how can you be, what does that look like? You know, you're going to be a robot to be resilient through the relentlessness of, you know, unwellness all day, every day.
Yeah.
So that was really hard. But I think also definitely being, you know, so I went down the traditional path, as pretty much, you know, I think the large majority of us do when we first become unwell. What do? I was in my very early 20s. I just went to my GP. I didn't know what else to do. And being told that I have an illness, and that's just how it's going to be. And that medication was really the only thing that was going to help, but I was going to have this for the rest of my life. That I believed it. Yeah, that was really hard.
What sort of things have helped then, you know, to deal with the most challenging bits? So just overall, what's been some of the more powerful things that have helped?
Yeah. Not GPs, that's for sure. Not saying, you know, that all GPs are like that, but, you know, when we're talking about my experience, I didn't find a GP that was helpful for me. So going in and getting a K10 done every time, and telling me that it's because I'm sick
Mm.
wasn't helpful at all.
Mm.
The kind of things that were helpful really is finding a whole range of sources, but the common theme was helping me to develop kindness and compassion for myself. So that's been through meditation and mindfulness, both, and yoga, so both going to those things, but also just listening to podcasts about it, reading books about it. Learning a bit about Buddhism, and I wouldn't say I'm not a religious person, but finding, I guess, some spirituality through those things, which I think the essence of that is about love and compassion, and you have to start with yourself before you can make that available for other people. Through those kind of self-learning things, I guess, but also through finding good therapists that also aren't interested in diagnosing me, but are interested in helping understand, what happened to me, what my trauma was that ultimately had me living in distress for a very long time afterwards, and helping me heal from that in a way that, again, was about nurturing and love for myself, and compassion for the distress I was experiencing.
And then I guess, like, you've sort of already mentioned what wasn't helpful, but was there anything else you wanted to add about particular things that just weren't helpful?
I think I probably have touched on it quite a bit already, but really just that writing me off really early on as instantly that I must have a genetic disorder that means, which I don't believe anymore. I haven't believed that for a long time, and the book that I mentioned, Lost Connections, is very evident, goes through all of the evidence base around anxiety and depression and nature versus nurture, and I think there's very compelling evidence nowadays that it's not just that I have a gene and it's inevitable that I was going to be. That's not true. So that wasn't helpful at all, because that didn't give me any hope, and it also it meant that I didn't then go and find out and explore what had happened to me. All I was given was what's wrong with me. And what I needed to do, and eventually found, but it took a long time, was found out what happened to me to heal from that, and that's how I could get better. I wasn't going to get better through just accepting that there was something wrong with me.
I know our other guest on the podcast today sort of touched on the same thing of not exactly what you're saying, but being written off and being told that sort of that was it. This is what your life is now. I don't think it's ever really a helpful thing to say that to someone.
Helpful, and it's just not true. Like, there's actually no evidence base for it. So
if you could say something to, like, your younger self or just yourself at the start of your experience, what would you sort of go back and tell yourself before you've been at this whole experience? I remember my first panic attack was I was actually studying psychology, and I was sitting in an abnormal psychology lecture. Unfortunately, they still teach that 25 years later. Not quite the right title for it.
No, but it's probably very telling of the way that those medical kind of model approaches are taught. And I had a massive panic attack because they were talking about different, dysfunctions or illnesses or whatever, and I thought, oh my God, that's me. I'm stuffed. Like, that's basically, and I had a massive panic attack, and it didn't stop then for years, basically. So I think I was only 19 then, actually. So what I would say to myself at that point was, stop doing psychology, which, I didn't become a psychologist, because that's not where you want to go, and it's not going to fit your values. And and that what you're experiencing is a normal human experience. It is normal. It's uncomfortable and it's scary, but it's normal and it's okay. And you are okay and you are enough. That's what I would say. Yeah.
I always find it an interesting experience to think about that stuff and what I would go back and say. So now to the actual last question. We're asking everyone who comes on the Ark that if there was one thing that you could take with you from the help or the support that you've received, and one thing that you could just leave behind to never exist again or to never be experienced, what would those two things be? What would you take? What would you leave?
Yeah, I would definitely take the energy and the focus and the care around self-compassion and self-kindness, and the focus, I guess, in supporting mine and other people's recovery through a lens on compassion. Definitely take that. And I think that's what the lived experience movement is. It is about nurturing and compassion and understanding. And probably not surprising from the rest of my questions, I would leave behind the medical model. I don't think it is helpful at all. I'm not suggesting that medications don't have a place. I took them for a really long time, and I think they did have some value for me. So I'm not anti-medication, but the medical model that tells us that we have a disease and we're broken and we're never going to get well again, I would definitely bin that.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and it was really lovely to chat.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of On the Ark. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we'll include some extra information in the show notes. And hope you'll join us next time.